All right, next. Come on, guys.
Rabbi, is there any evidence of women ever being counted for minyan?
So this is a good question. The first place that it says you can't count women in a minyan, I believe it's the Rif is the first person to ever bring it down. The Rambam actually doesn't mention it, but the Shulchan Aruch does. Talmud doesn't say that you can't count women in a minyan.
All right, so women were never counted in a never. I mean, the even if it was ever mentioned by some people, it never happened in history.
No. I'm saying that the Talmud doesn't prohibit it.
All right. Okay.
The truth is that women never went to synagogue. It says, the Rambam says that a man should let his wife out twice a month, I believe. All right, that statement is cultural. Women stayed at home. This notion of going to the synagogue, especially when it had a different connotation than it does nowadays. Why do people go to the synagogue nowadays? Basically to say Kaddish or to help someone else say Kaddish. Why? Because we tied in this notion of an Aliyas Neshama, that you're giving your dead relative one step out of hell with saying Kaddish Yatum, which is the mourner's Kaddish. Because of this Kabbalistic notion, this is why people go to the synagogue nowadays. There's no halakha to go to the synagogue. You could pray at home and you'll fulfill, you won't be able to say Davar Shebikdusha, Borchu, and the portions that you can't say without a minyan, but there's no halakha to pray with a minyan. It's a nice thing. Clearly, Shulchan Aruch prohibits women in a minyan. The Rambam doesn't. I believe the Rif was the first one to do it. It doesn't appear in the Talmud like this. The Talmud doesn't prohibit women. There's even an opinion by the Mordechai. Mordechai says that if you need a tenth, you could count a woman. That doesn't really mean much. In the Talmud, it says that if you need a tenth, you could count like a kid holding a Sefer Torah, a katan with a Sefer Torah, or a chumash, some people say.
Who said that, Rabbi? Who said that?
It's like this in the Talmud. The Talmud says that if you need a tenth, apart from that statement that you could free a slave, you could count a kid holding a Torah scroll. But a Torah scroll back then was equivalent to a chumash today. So, some people, when they need a tenth, they'll count a kid who's pre-bar mitzvah with the chumash, like holding a chumash, and they'll count that as a tenth. But
even saying Kaddish is a minhag, isn't it?
Well, the whole prayer of Kaddish was really developed at the time of the Gaonim. Okay, but being that people didn't have this minhag of saying Kaddish for the dead, and they don't view it as a minhag, they view it as something true. It's something that you have to do when someone dies. Outside of the cemetery, people say, Kaddish as a cemetery is brought down as a halakha, but it's not brought down as an early halakha to say Kaddish for a dead relative to get him out of Gehenna. The first time that was mentioned, I believe, is in the Or Zeruah, but it appears in Shulchan Aruch as a minhag, and now it's become like a halakha. But this is why people go to synagogue, because they're thinking that someone there might need me to say, might need a minyan to say Kaddish for the dead relatives. So everyone's dying to get to the synagogue. Also, people back then prayed like how Arabs pray in Israel nowadays. Like when Muslims in Israel, they got to pray. They're not fighting to find a mosque to pray in. They'll pray right there. They'll take their little mat and say their prayers. Nowadays, with the luxury of people working from home or having a car, everyone's trying to make the synagogue, but people didn't do that back then. A beis medrash was a place to study, not necessarily a place to pray. But while they were studying, they would take advantage of them having a minyan. And then the practice of Kaddish started with the practice of Kaddish Derabanan, which is when someone said words of Torah, then they would, in honor of those words of Torah being said, they would praise God with a Kaddish. Initial Kaddish was Kaddish Derabanan, the rabbi's Kaddish. But now it's Kaddish after Kaddish after Kaddish, because of trying to get dead relatives or relatives out of hell. It's really
that is more of a Kabbalistic idea that, that this whole idea has been strengthened by, right?
It appears in the Zohar like this, and it appears in the small Masechtas. There's some parts of the Talmud that were added in much later. They were called the Masechtas Katanas. And there's a Masechta there. I believe it's Masechet Kala. Anyways, I'm saying it's reiterated in the Zohar, but all these later tractates appeared when the Zohar was written, which is really 1270, the Common Era. So there's a story of I believe it's Rabbi Kiva, who's walking through a graveyard, and he sees this man that he's burnt. He's charred, and he asks him, "What are you doing here?" And he's like, "Well, it's Shabbos, and there's this understanding that neshamas are let out of Gehenna for Shabbos. And he's being tortured in Gehenna because his relatives won't say words of Torah in his name. He never mentions Kaddish. So he tells, I believe it's Rabbi Akiva, to get his son to say words of Torah in his name, in his honor. And that's going to alleviate his punishment in Gehenna. And that's where the whole notion of saying Kaddish for a dead relative began.
With Rabbi Akiva?
With the Medrash regarding Rabbi Akiva, but the notion of Kaddish doesn't appear. But there's a Medrash of him running into someone in the graveyard who's being tortured because, his relatives won't say words of Torah in his name.
Okay. All right.
All right, guys. It's 12:30. I appreciate you guys hanging out this long. Expect this talk to be chopped up and be put online just because this allows my channel to flourish. You guys asking great questions and putting me on the spot here. I'm telling you, what other channel can you go online and ridicule the rabbi and challenge him? Only here.
Yeah, because this is not a monologue. Yeah.
That's right. It's not a monologue. It's a dialogue.